Welcome all of you to the presentation of Jeff Holt's recorder making workshop. He is a wonderful recorder builder here in Southern California. He happens to be in my class, the Recorder Players West class. So I want to welcome you all. Thank you so much for all your interest. I just love his shop. I own one of his recorders and am very, very pleased with it. Jeff, thank you. And take it away.
The first thing we do is we have to make reamers. If you look over here, I have all kinds of steel in here, all different kinds of pieces of steel. So I've done all those measurements and I know what size piece of steel I have. So then I come over to my metal lathe and I have to set the piece of metal in my metal lathe, set that in there. And you can see I've created on the wall back here all my data points, my coordinates. So at 0, if I call that 0, it's 22.3 millimeters. 20 millimeters down, it's 0.2 less, 0.1, 22, so on. So you do all that. Then you take this and you take it over to a machine called a mill. And that's what this is. This is a mill, it's not a drill. So you have another jig, it's not this one, another jig I have, and it sets in here. And this thing, I can set it how far it goes back and forth, and it creates this, which is a sharp edge. I hope you can see that. See how it's very, very sharp. Then you have to make a set of those. You have to make a head reamer, a body reamer, and a foot reamer. Then you take your piece of wood. Before you get your piece of wood, you have to come over here, which I call my toy box. And I look in my toy box and I say, is there any pieces of boxwood or anything that's going to work for what I'm looking for? I have maple, I have boxwood, I have plum. I even have some African blackwood, but it's not over here. Then you take it over here, you saw it up into little pieces. You can see that some of these pieces are not exactly what you might want to use. Then you take those and you go back over to your lathe and you turn the pieces round. So now you just have a piece of round boxwood in this case. Now, this is where, how do you season the wood and so on? What I do is some people use regular ovens to try to get the percentage of moisture down to a certain extent. But believe it or not, I like to use microwaves. I put it in microwaves and microwave it very short, intense periods of time, many, many times. And it really seems to soften the wood. It heats it up from the inside rather than from the heat going to the inside. It sort of heats it up and works its way out. And then over, say, 25 or 30 of these treatments, I have a very stable piece of wood. If you don't really dry your wood really well, you end up being what this looks like. Can you see that? It looks like a banana. That's because I didn't season the wood really well. The next part is after you have all your reamers and your wood is all set to go, then you put your piece of wood into the chuck. It's 4-jaw chuck, and I can create a pilot bore. Then I ream it with the reamer, and then I create a socket. And that's what that is. You see that? There's your socket. It's reamed, and it's all done. That's all it is. And you do that for each piece. So then you have your center section. And then you have your head. And the head, I socket it, I turn it, and I sort of turn it into this dumbbell shape. And that tells me where the block line is right there. That's the end of the block. That tells me where that is. Then I take it over to another machine that I made. Then this goofy little tool here does one little thing. Put this guy in here, and it sits in here. This router drops down, and I go so many thousandths this way, so many thousandths that way, and I pull it out, and it creates this little window right there. So that's where the beginning of my window is. Then I come over to this machine, and that fits in here, and it's indexed, and then I have to adjust all this, of course, but you can see how that works. So you just keep adjusting this by adjusting how much it cuts. And I have a 4-to-1 ratio, which means this beam is 4 times the length of this piece. So I have to know how much to raise and lower it. And I've created this little thing. I can set that. I can move it so it's exactly the same length as whatever that cutter is. and then I can reset it to 0, and then I can tell exactly how much I'm cutting. Then you remember I talked about the upstand had to be angled. Well, these wings back here allow me to set this, tighten it down, and then I can move this back and forth to each side when I'm cutting it, so it cuts at an angle like that. So I set it up to do exactly what I need it to do. Then you say, what do you do next? Well, I go over to the wood lathe back here in the back, and I turn a piece of cedar. Well, I have this box of all these little blades that I made, and they all have numbers on them, which says 14. It gives me a 14 millimeter cylinder, and usually I have it also stamped with something else that tells me how big the upstand's going to be. So I put that in there depending on the instrument, and then I take this, and this is how I pre-shape the block. And this goes around and around, and you say, well, how does that give you an angle on it? It's because this thing rotates. I don't know if you can see that, but it's got an angled plate on it. So when I push it back and forth, it's changing the geometry every time I push it backward and forward on the side, and it creates an upstand that you can see is narrower at this end than this end. Okay, so there it is. There's your pre-shaped block. And then you start fitting that into your head joint. It has to start fitting. So then after you've done all that and you got everything working, then you end up with something like this. So you can see this. There's my dumbbell shape. I've cut the windway. I've put the block in it. It's actually working. And I have it on here. I've started working the foot, but you see there's no tone holes in it. So I still have a long ways to go. Then you go to the next stage, which is I have tone holes. I have the block in it. There's no beak. And then you can start playing them and tuning them, voicing them, and so on. And then eventually, at the end, I'll cut the beak and so on when I'm satisfied that everything is working properly. So that's sort of the process in a very quick nutshell, if that makes sense. If I said this is a flute or an alto recorder, then I go down to an alto and G. Then we go to what we call a third flute, a fourth flute, a fifth flute is your soprano, and then a sixth flute, and then a sopranino. And then we can go the other way, a voice flute in D, a tenor in C. This is a low fourth flute, a tenor in B flat, believe it or not. Just like this. This is G, B flat, A, C, D, and F. Okay, when do you stain and polish? It depends. I usually stain it at the end if I'm going to stain the instrument, because sometimes I like to leave it as a, natural instrument. You have different kinds of stain that you can use on the instruments. And then you come up with even crazier things where you have all these sort of really highly figured instruments that I've created.
Did you all have to just kind of start from scratch with inventing these tools, or did you have models to copy them from? Or, did you learn this recorder making business from somebody and then you kind of improved it?
I first started this when I was going to architecture school. I was in architecture school, I think, the same time that Wynn was teaching engineering at Cal Poly Pomona. And some of the projects I was studying downtown, I would walk by the LA County Museum of Art, and there was this little street busker guy out there playing and playing. And pretty soon I kept thinking, wow, that's really interesting. What's he playing? And he was playing plastic recorders. So for a couple of years, I tried to do this on my own. There really isn't any books on recorder building. You can find violin books, on guitar books, all these sorts of things, but you have to sort of figure a lot of this stuff out on your own. So my big mistake was I said, well, if they built this during the Renaissance and that, how hard could it be? I realized that it was a lot tougher than I thought it was going to be. Alec Loretto from New Zealand, who had done a lot of workshops in Austria and all over Europe on instrument building, he said he was going to give a workshop at Dominican College, but he was only accepting 10 people for the class. So you can bet, as soon as I saw that, they told me I was the first one on the phone. I want to sign up for that. I got to do this. That was about 1990. And I kept in contact with Alec Loretto over the years. And then in 2002, I flew down to New Zealand and worked in his workshop and so on in New Zealand and learned everything else. At that time, I'd already been working for well over 10 years on my own with the stuff, but I went down to him and did some study with him and in his workshop and so on. And I even have a little picture, which is kind of funny. I don't know if you can see that. That's Alec Loretto, myself, and Mary Beth. So that was really how I got into it and how I really propelled myself, because there's so many little pieces that if you don't have sort of a mentor to sort of say, well, you need to look at it this way, or this is an approach to it. Believe me, there's a million different approaches to instrument building and how you do it. And just like cleaning or oiling, everybody has a perspective on it. If you have somebody that can kind of help you with it, like I know Bob Marvin, Tom Prescott, they all did an apprenticeship with Friedrich von Huene.
Right.
So they learned all those sort of skills there.
So you would have had maybe some of Alec's tools as a model to kind of
exactly
work off of and then develop your own.
Exactly. I saw his Windway cutter. I saw how he did his. And so this is probably 99% the same as his. But like I said, this is about my fourth version. I said, oh, if I did it again, I want to change this, or I did this, I'm going to do that. So it sort of evolves. And then I have, I don't know how many plans that I got from Alec.
Some museums don't like you to have the metal gauges inside, the one you showed. What do you use in that case?
That's the one that they pretty much are okay with, because the contact is literally almost nothing. And you don't have to take the block out of the head joint, because the strain gauge, very gentle little spring flex on it. So you can come in and go all the way up to the block and measure it, and then you can measure it on the way out. Whereas with your snap gauges, you can't do that, because it's the bore is wider here than it is here. So once you get it up here, you can't get it back out. And most of the museums today, there's no measuring allowed on any of it. So I was lucky that I made pretty good friendships with Robert Sheldon at the time of the Dayton C. Miller. Once they figured out I wasn't a maniac, I wasn't going to, break their instruments apart or gouge them or do all these things, they felt comfortable. But it took probably each of those cases, probably 2 years of writing letters back and forth and telling them, how am I going to measure it? What am I going to use? All this. So they were convinced that I wasn't going to do damage to anything in their collection. So.
Yeah. So we see a bunch of tools in your shop. And so therefore the question arose, do you consider your instruments to be handmade or a combination of hand and machine made?
It has to be a combination, because, I'm still using lathes. I don't know how you could do it completely handmade. Even the original makers had foot treadle lathes. That's a machine. All the cutting, the labium edge and the files and the blades. I have all these special blades. There's a left blade and a right blade, and you use those in order to cut, the edge on each side of the labium and so on. So I have these blades, and that's what I use to cut. And that's all done by hand. Putting the block in and voicing it and machining all that, that's all done by hand.
How many hours does it take to build an instrument from start to finish?
It depends. A one-piece instrument, a Renaissance soprano, obviously doesn't have all the fancy turnings and things that has to go on with that and all the different pieces. It's basically 2 reamers, one this way and one this way. I'm sure this doesn't take me as long as it does the other things, and then there's all these other things, like you go to a museum, you find instrument of original instrument. They don't play at our pitches. They don't play at 440 or 415. They often play at 405 or 403 or something like that. So you make all the reamers and you do all that and you play, okay, I like it, but now I have to scale it to play at a different pitch. Then you start playing it. And then you realize that note is out of tune. Well, where in the board do I adjust that? So then I have crazy things like this, which is just a little piece of wood on the end of a stick. So you say, okay, your G is flat or something. So you want to see where in the board that's going to make a difference. So I go, oh, it's right there that I have to make an adjustment to. And you look at it with a tuner. Is it flat? Is it sharp? Or whatever you're trying to do. So there's an awful lot of experimentation, scaling, all that sort of thing to get an instrument to play where you want it to play.
Could you briefly explain your voicing procedure?
First of all, it's fitting the block into your instrument, and it has to fit. I have this little cutaway. So what you're doing when you're voicing is you're adjusting the space and the opening of that little slit, which is your windway, and you're adjusting these chamfers on the block and the chamfers on the upper part of the windway. And you don't do one and then do something else. They sort of work in combination. The other issue that most people don't know is your block is not totally flat on top. And I'm not talking about that way. We can all see it's curved this way. It's also curved this way. You have to do that with a scalpel. So I take it off, and you take so many thousandths, so you create a little bit of a dip this way. You put it back in, you say, oh, is that better? One of the things about recorder making is you have to learn when you better quit, because you can easily go too far one way. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, there's no coming back. I can't glue wood onto it. I have to make a new block.
For tuning, you're using a tuner. Do you have a musical ear was one of the questions. So I guess, when are you satisfied with the sound of an instrument? And tuner, you can read it probably, but it also has to have a very steady airstream. How do you deal with that?
Well, some people over the course of time that I've interacted with instrument builders, they have these sort of machines that blow a constant volume of air into the instrument, and then they work with it this way and that way. For me, I've always sort of said, okay, I understand that. I can't really argue with that, but I have not yet found the person that can blow that perfectly smooth and constant. So it has to be, when you play it, how does it feel? You have to not look at the tuner all the time, but you have to, where is the center of that sound? Is that okay? Okay, I like that. And then I go on to the next node until you get the whole thing working as one unit. It's hard to say. You can't do one piece of it without it affecting everything else. Just like when I was showing you putting that little stick down there to find certain parts of the bore, how it affected other parts of the bore. The problem with that is it gives you an idea. But every time you change that part of the bore, guess what? You're going to change some other note, or you're going to change some other thing. So it's always sort of a compromising situation. I remember I had a big argument with a mechanical engineer early on when I was making reamers and stuff. He wanted to say, give me the maximum diameter, give me the small diameter and the length, and I'll make you a reamer. I said, that isn't going to work. And he says, what do you mean? I said, no, because it changes depending on where it is in the bore to make things play in tune. So he says, well, that's not how you make a reamer. You don't know how to make a reamer. I said, I'm not making a So we had big arguments of that. And I finally had to just tell him, never mind, I'll figure it out on my own.
English boxwood is hard to get. Would you be willing to share who your supplier is, and what types of wood do you work with? And is the white parts that we saw, is that ivory?
Yes, that's genuine imitation ivory. It's imitation, even though they do a pretty good job. I don't know if you can see that.
Is it a type of resin, or?
Yes, and they even make some of it with grain on it. I've never used real ivory.
So what type of wood do you use? And the striped wood, is that stain, or is that actually wood?
Like this? You mean the
Yeah.
figure, what they call chatoints, I think it is.
And what type of wood are we looking at right now?
That is maple. I use vacuum chambers to treat my maple, because trying to cut a windway in very figured wood where the grain is actually almost changing direction like this is really tough because the blade wants to chatter. So what I've done is I've developed my own procedure for treating the maple, which actually gives me a little bit of an advantage to be able to cut windways in. Most of my instruments are boxwood. I do have some maple instruments, and every now and then I'll make some plum. I've made a fair amount of, that's all African blackwood. That's with
Nice.
all the little imitation. Now that's a trick. How do you put that in between you see that on the foot with the little,
Yes.
there's some planning that has to go on with that.
If you're in the process of drilling the finger holes, the tone holes, how do you
Yes.
decrease a hole diameter? That's when you just explained you're adding wax, beeswax to it, right?
If it's gotten the undercutting, if I've gone too far on a tone hole and I need to change what I've done, I put beeswax on the inside.
Jeff, you mentioned that Alec Loretto gave you some plans for
Oh,
recorders.
yeah. Yeah.
And are you copying an original Rottenburg or Denner, or what type of?
Yeah. I have all kinds of plans. These books are just a couple of books. These are all Baroque designs. So, I mean, I can flip in here like I'm copying original instruments. Like here's the Bizet 392 and Dayton C. Miller, or here's the Denner 415 or in Brussels.
So have you specifically tuned in on one of them to perfect that, or do you like to jump from, oh, I'll do a Denner now, and next will be a Rottenburg, and next will be a Brisson, or?
I work on it until I figure like they seem to be working pretty well. You know, I don't like to make a whole bunch of one instrument. Most of my productions will be two or three of a particular instrument, and then I want to move on to something else. It's one of the reasons, because I've made a lot of furniture and stuff in my house, and it's one of the reasons I never make chairs, like dining room chairs. I don't want to make six of the same thing. I mean, it's just, it gets too, I don't want to be production. I'm not really doing this like Tom or Von Huna or something to really make a living at. You know, it's because I enjoy it. You know, I like making the instruments. And
Can the African blackwood be compared in sound to like a grenadilla?
yeah, it's the same thing.
So we notice the difference between the Renaissance and the Baroque recorders. We know from playing them that the bore on the inside is different. But how about the outside? Is it just an aesthetical choice, or is there also a sound implication to all these beautiful embellishments on the outside?
Most of the embellishments, Eau de Terre, I think, was one of the first ones. They made it because they were making the instruments in pieces. And during the Baroque period, just like the architecture, the clothing, everything else, had a certain style and very opulent, or whatever you want to call it.
Would it also then make sense if this piece, because of it's a joint, it's thinner, and
Yes.
then to strengthen this one, this is why we have these belts to make the joint parts a little bit more sturdy.
You have to have it in pieces, absolutely. You know, most of the Renaissance instruments are one piece sort of instruments. Like
This
your
is
tenor.
this is my Jeff Holt tenor. It's all in one piece.
So if you make a mistake in that, you throw a big chunk of wood away.
And it's an interesting challenge to find a bag that works with this. But I discovered that for pool cues,
Yep.
they work perfectly.
I think I told you that. Get a pool cue cover. Yeah.
Here's one last question. How would you define a really well-made recorder?
You know, it's like, how do you define a really well-made car? I mean, is a Ferrari better than a Ford? Well, yeah, but it's just the craftsmanship that's gone into it and how well does it play and so on. I mean, I think overall now most of the instruments are pretty well made. You know, obviously during the Renaissance, how pleasing it was supposed to be. They just weren't so concerned during that period with the sort of opulent style. And some of the things that we have, like a fontanelle cover, we would sort of say, oh, that's sort of a nice design. Well, all it was to cover this really sort of crude key work that they put on,
Protected. Yeah.
protect it and cover it because it's not real pretty, you know.
Jeff, have you ever considered teaching making recorders to others?
Not really. I've had people come and watch what I do and they get ideas. And I wish we could do like little field trip or something. I literally have hundreds of reamers. I mean, I have so many reamers. And here's the sad part. Sometimes I forget to mark it. So I have a reamer and I look at it and go, oh, what's that for? You know, so it takes a lot of backtrack to figure out what it was for and so on. But you're right, an awful lot of work for socket cutters, windway blades. I mean, I use cubic boron nitride grinders to cut high-speed steel and so many things I didn't have time to even talk about.
Jeff, thank you so much. This was fabulous. To me, I have a completely different appreciation of my handmade recorders. How much goes into this, just making tools, coming up with the right tool, the right material to cut the wood, and then all the different trials that you've done and all the wood that therefore is kind of not usable anymore, right? The trial and error part of it. Thank you so much for sharing your workshop with us. And I hope everybody stays safe and healthy until then. And thank you for joining.